the second day of the CE Week press conferences and sessions. My name is Maureen Jensen. I'm the editor of Technology Integrator, CD's Electronic Lifestyles, and Tel Magazines, and of course online. And we have a very full program for you today. Fascinating guest speakers. We'll be learning a lot of new cool stuff. So stick around. At this time, I'd like to welcome to the stage Mr. Eric Girdler, who is going to be introducing our keynote today, and I'm really excited to hear her speak. Eric Girdler is the New York City Economic Development Corporation person. Come on up.
Good morning and welcome. I am Eric Girdler, and I am the Managing Director for the Center for Economic Transformation at the New York City Economic Development Corporation, which is the city's primary vehicle for promoting economic growth here in the city. And the Center for Economic Transformation works on the mayor's program to diversify the economy and to grow jobs in the city. And of course, we are thrilled, the New York City Economic Development Corporation, to have partnered with CE Week to showcase New York's innovation ecosystem. And as part of that, we've done a number of different things where we've curated a startup pavilion on who and what is next in New York City tech. We've brought together some of the leading creative production platforms in New York, and also last night here on this stage organized a pitch night for New York's next Top Makers. One of the wonderful things that we've seen this week is that the New York City tech boom isn't just on the web, and it's not just in the cloud, but increasingly in the open hardware and makerspace. New York City's consumer electronics startups draw from the city's ambitious culture and vibrant community to fuel disruption. And it's great to see them tackling many different challenges, universal challenges like disaster recovery, and personal challenges like buying stylish clothing. And that is a challenge that I'm going to have to clearly take on after this speech and go downstairs. But we're of course very proud to be a capital of entrepreneurship here in New York City with its breadth of industries. And despite the many ongoing challenges today, we as a city and with our mayor are not waiting around. We are making sure that entrepreneurship provides the momentum that we need so that New York City remains as a global economic leader. And as we know, and as we've seen this week, with the vast market for products and services and the great talent that we have here in New York City is already one of the best places in the world to be a maker. Now, of course, we've got living proof of that today. Our speaker, our keynote speaker, Ayah Bdeir, has become a role model and pillar of the New York City's maker community. Now, before I give you a little bit of her background, she's a true technologist, because I know from having spent time in that community, when you're taking the red eye, that's a sign of being a true technologist. I long ago graduated from that to taking the 4 o'clock light, which is called the pink eye instead of the red eye. So I give her credit. She is a graduate of the MIT Media Lab, a TED Fellow, and the CEO and founder of littleBits, a company that makes learning about electronics fun, easy, and creative. Her New York-based company is reinventing open source electronics while educating our next generation of tech-savvy kids and hopefully a generation of future startup founders. And with that, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome Ayah to the stage.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you so much for the NYCEDC for everything that you do. And I apologize before the presentation in case I'm incoherent, because the red eye was also late, and so there's all this travel drama, but hopefully this is going to be exciting enough for everybody. So I'm really thrilled to be here today because I really believe very, very much in the maker movement, and I am perhaps one of the most avid fans of New York City as well. I grew up in Beirut, Lebanon. I went to school at MIT, and when I couldn't wait, when I was finishing school, I couldn't wait to finish so I could go live in New York. And I'm basically living the dream that I always had, and so I'm very thankful for the city and all the efforts that are happening around it. Today I'm going to be talking to you about making in New York City. And before I talk about sort of the ecosystem, entrepreneurship, some of the trends that are happening in making in New York, I wanted to unpack the title a little bit, which is Making in New York. First of all, let's discuss the basics of it. Why make? Why do we make? Obviously, it's not obvious anymore that people have to make things. You know, the world has become fully interactive and very virtual, and a lot of people make apps, make websites, make virtual spaces. And so why do we still make things? So I'd like to propose a duel to sort of look at this process and show and explain why I myself make things, and a lot of us makers do as well. A duel between making an app and making a thing. So when you want to make an app, sort of really simplifying this process, and this is a little bit of a caricature, of course, but simplifying the process, when you want to make an app, you start by coming up with an idea. You prototype the idea, and prototyping an app takes anywhere from 1 to 3 months, maybe, extending, of course, to more than that. You test, you iterate, also a process that takes around that same time. You apply to the App Store, you eat ramen while you're waiting for the App Store, and then usually 6 days after, 12 days, maybe something like that, you get approved. Assuming that you built a good app, and we're going to assume the same thing when you build hardware, assuming you build a good app, you now advertise. And if you build a good product and you're able to advertise, you're able to cash in. Do you have an error in your product? That's totally okay. You fix the error, send an upgrade to your customers, and you're cashing in again. Now, making a thing, that's obviously a very different process. You start by coming up with an idea, probably a similar process than coming up with an idea for an app. But then when you want to prototype, you're buying the material, you're finding the material, buying the material, shipping the material, fabricating, testing, iterating. Every one of these processes takes between 1 and 3 or even 6 months. Sometimes sourcing materials takes up to 1 year. You're then also eating ramen, but then you want to, let's say that you've iterated and you've gotten to a prototype that you like, that you want to manufacture. Now it's time to manufacture. You're going to locate the factory. You're going to try to go find a factory that wants to talk to you, that wants to produce your product, and that believes that it's going to be the next thing. You have to purchase the material. Then you commit to an order. When I first started manufacturing littleBits, they asked me, what is your minimum order? And I said, 200. And they said, 200,000? I said, no, just 200. And so it's a difficult process to get a factory to work with you. You then commit to the order, you manufacture, you iterate, and any one of these steps takes between 6 and 12 months. Even then, you have the product. You're moving inventory, shipping inventory, maintaining it, paying, shipping logistics, advertising it, and then you're cashing in. But what happens after you have an error, if you have an error in your product? You can't just send an email upgrade. You're shipping the product back, you have an angry customer, so things are happening. So this, you know, if you look at kind of the equation, making an app versus making a thing, it's not a very effective value proposition. Effectively, it takes you about 45 months to make a product. So in my case, it took me 3.5 years, which is a little less than that. To make an app could take you up to 12 months. And you could potentially make about the same amount of money. So why do we make things? It's not an obvious answer. The highlights here are really very personal, but I found them to be very much across different makers around the city and the world, really. First of all, things are universal. Things have the power to cut across languages, to cut across countries, to cut across cities. When you produce something good, something effective, and you put it in front of somebody anywhere in the world, whether it's a grandparent in India or it's a child in Wisconsin, they have the power to affect them in a really personal way. You don't have to translate, you don't have to train somebody to use technology. It has a very universal appeal. The second thing, and maybe sort of a very obvious comment, is that things exist. And I think in today's world, that's no longer something that's to be taken for granted either. This is an extract from an article that Ayah Bdeir wrote for the New York Times when he wrote a profile about the maker movement and profiled a few companies in New York, particularly one of them that I'm going to be talking about later called Adafruit. Anafrin is a New York-based factory, electronics factory. They make electronic kits to get kids, but also adults excited about making electronics. And so they, to explain to him what they do, they told him, why don't you sit in the assembly line and help us make these kits? So he started doing that process, and this is what he said. It was surreal to do this assembly line work in Lower Manhattan. It felt like a violation of the economic laws of nature. The tasks were at once mindless and engaging. They required focus because if you were distracted for a minute, you would mess up and your error would ramify into the world. The most invigorating part was that I didn't think about email, my phone, or Twitter while I was making. I was, against all modern odds, indivisibly present. And I think for me, that's one of the most important things about making. When you are making something, there are really one of two states that you're in. Either you are so engaged, you're either frustrated, or you're inspired, or you're thinking about how to make it, or you're trying to not get burned. You're very focused on what you're doing. You're not sort of multitasking and opening 100 tabs at the same time. Or the other process is when you're making and you're sort of in a groove, it becomes kind of a trance, a sort of meditation, which I find really to be invigorating. And then the last thing, which is I think why we make things, are because things make memories. You know, this is an extract from a series about kids with portraits of kids with their toys, and you can see how toys are their most prized possessions. I have a hard time thinking that kids are going to grow up remembering their favorite app and cherishing an app. I can't visualize how that would happen. Maybe it will. Maybe I'm being short-sighted. But for me, things make memories. So that's how I started littleBits. So littleBits is essentially electronic, what have been called electronic Lego. There are little bricks that are each a complete circuit that are pre-engineered and pre-assembled and snapped together with magnets so that you can't put them the wrong way. And the idea behind littleBits is that just like when we were growing up, Lego was the building block of the world that allowed you to understand the world around you. We're making these building blocks to allow kids to understand the world around them and to make their own robots, to make their own cars, to make their own interactive dollhouses, to really participate in the consumer experience. So the second portion of the title, why make in New York? Now that we know that this is sort of something that we think is valuable, why make in New York? New York is a very, very special city. It's a very special city because of its diversity. You're able to pull from knowledge from the fashion industry, knowledge from the finance industry, from media. You're able to pull from the food industry. You're able to pull from some of the best universities that are in New York or in the New York area or in neighboring states. And I think that's something that's very, very important because when you're working on something, some of the most innovative ideas come from the intersection of disciplines and also comes from you sometimes stepping outside yourself. And unlike Silicon Valley, unlike Boston even, New York has this power to make you step outside yourself and get inspired by other types of people. So I'm going to briefly talk about some of the trends that I think are important and are happening around the maker movement in New York particularly. And some of them are not sort of specific to New York, but I think the group of them together are very specific to New York. And there are some stories that I'll go through, but I'm happy to send the presentation to whoever wants to dig in more. So the basic trends are solving complex problems, innovating at the intersections, fostering communities, creating platforms for innovations, curating, and then mission-driven making. And in each one of these examples, in each one of these trends, I'll pick a couple of companies, people, or spaces as an example, but they really are not comprehensive, so please excuse if you think things are missing. The first trend that I'd like to talk about is solving complex problems. And this is not so much specific about New York itself, but it's very surprising somehow that it is happening in New York. We have people that are making quadcopters for disaster recovery zone to be able to survey disasters that are happening. A company, Honeybee Robotics, is creating robotic tools to help DARPA reuse pieces of satellites that are dead, and that's happening on 34th Street. The NYU Presbyterian Robot Therapy initiative is basically creating robotic contraptions, attachments, and prosthetics that allow people with strokes or with diseases that need rehabilitation, or even to help them with old age, to help them sort of distribute the weight. Same thing that's happening with similar thing happening with StrongFest. A group of young makers starting in New York that are making these vests that manual laborers can wear to distribute the weight better so that they can avoid injury. So in this case, they have a water bottle, a delivery person, having sort of a very manual process to this job every day, and the vest is meant to really alleviate that. These are some of the problems that are happening. There are some slightly, maybe smaller problems. There's a company that existing called Fitbark, which is essentially Fitbit for dogs. I don't know if people know what Fitbit is. It's an activity monitor system for dogs. May not be a disaster recovery copter, but at the same time, you have a New York apartment and a dog, you probably need to do something about their fitness. So, all important problems. The second trend is really innovating at the intersections. And I talked about this briefly, but I really believe that there's a lot of innovation that happens at the intersection of disciplines. There's at one point where we sort of decided this is engineering, and this is chemistry, and this is math, and this is fashion, and somehow we started to lose what's in between. But these intersections are happening again. So a couple of examples I picked here are at the intersection of biology and technology. The top picture is from Bottega Alga, which is a company that is based out of a community lab in Brooklyn. And what they're doing, the founder, Amanda Parks, is doing, what they're doing is basically doing research on algae that could generate energy. It's essentially photobioreactors made of algae. And it's based out of a space in Brooklyn, and where some architects are working and some computer scientists are working, and she sort of has her lab there. In the same space, and I'll show a picture of that space as well, we have a group called GenSpace, which essentially created a hacker space for synthetic biology. So they're inviting the community and kids in particular to come in and experiment with synthetic biology for a very, very low membership fee, or I think even free. So they're really sort of creating, using the models that we've used for technology, applying them to biology, to synthetic biology, to energy harvesting, and really combining these efforts in ways that were very much unexpected. And I think a lot of really interesting things are happening there. Slightly on the sort of closer to the entertainment scale are some intersections that are also very interesting. The top left picture is Super Pong by a group called Super Uber. They're based in a community space in the West Village, and essentially they recreated the foosball, combined it with Pong, and made it with computer vision. So it's a very entertaining installation that gets kids and adults alike very engaged, and it's a combination of computer science, sports, software, but also entertainment. And then lower on the right corner, you have the float table, which is one of the sort of seminal pieces from a group called from a company called Rock Paper Robot, a group of founded by an MIT roboticist who decided that she loves to do furniture, so she started to make robotic furniture. Why not? And these things are happening in New York. They're being manufactured in New York. They're being finished and shipped out of New York, and that's something that's very refreshing. Another trend that's important, and arguably, I think even the most important trend that's happening and that's powering all this sort of revolution is people who are fostering communities. The first sort of instinct when we say fostering communities is often online communities, but in fact there's a very prominent physical element to those first. The first type of fostering communities initiative that's happening is these hacker spaces. I don't know if people know about them, but basically a hackerspace is, usually a group of electronics or programming or sort of tech enthusiasts in general that come together, take up a space, and decide they're going to start a hackerspace. So they start to bring their own equipment, they bring their own soldering irons or their own laser cutter, or they bring their own hand-pressed drill, or they bring their own, old stash of radios that they want to disassemble. They start a hackerspace, and it becomes sort of a really nice community space that people come to. These spaces are important because they've been incubating real companies. They're not just a sort of a plaything. So NYC Resistor on the top left corner is based in Brooklyn and has incubated the company. It was founded by the founder, but also incubated a company called MakerBot, which is the leading desktop 3D printing company in the industry, and was just recently bought by Stratasys. So these are real companies that are coming out of here, but also a lot of younger generation is being trained and getting excited about the field. Hack Manhattan, Alpha One Labs, they do classes, they have membership opportunities, and they have shared resources like machines and equipment that you could use. Slightly on the more institutional end of it are some media labs. And these are, I would call institutional because usually there's sort of either a funding body or an organization behind them that is basically deciding to create the space. On the upper right corner is IBEAM, Art and Technology Center. And I have a very personal story with IBEAM because IBEAM is essentially the place where I got started. After I graduated from MIT, I decided that I wanted to get into the real world. This was 2006. So I went into finance. And so I worked in financial software for a couple of years. And then I was not happy. The market was at its peak. I was doing very well, but I was really sort of feeling very disconnected with what I was doing in my life. And so I quit. I took a fellowship at IBEAM. I took almost, I think, a 5-time pay cut, and I went to IBEAM to become a fellow. Essentially what they have is a very large space in Chelsea on 21st Street. They have a fellowship program where they subsidize, they offer you they used to, at that time it was $23,000 a year, which isn't much in New York, but is very, very, very important when you're deciding to make a career change and want just a cushion. And so that's where I started. I went sort of the first few weeks to IBEAM, sat at my desk and started thinking, all right, what am I going to make? And those are the beginning days that started littleBits. It's really important to have these spaces and these locations and these institutions that allow you to think. Innovation cannot happen in between meetings and in between jobs and in between travel. There are times that you have to sort of devote, that people want to devote time to think, to read, to research, to get inspired by people around them, and these media labs are doing that. IBEAM is an example, a very, very good example. I would consider sort of a very big player in the maker movement in New York particularly, but also Public Lab and Third Ward are playing a very big role as well. They're fostering research that's happening in open source and the environment. They're fostering sort of a lot of skill building that's happening in fashion and in software and in different kinds of skill building, and it's very, very important. Slightly in between sort of the hacker spaces and the media labs are the community studios. And I kind of struggled with the word a little bit, so I chose community studios, but it's kind of an arbitrary word. But basically what this means is that these are spaces that are not quite hacker spaces, which are really sort of grassroots, but they're also not institutional. They're typically people that have rented out a space larger than they need and have decided to rent out portions of it and in order to have kind of a co-working environment. So next on the upper left corner is where GenSpace and Bottega Alga, which I talked about earlier, are based, and it's a large building in Brooklyn that's owned by this person, Al Atara, who's basically just renting out space for very, very cheap for designers and artists and engineers. On the right side is CoLab, and that also has a very personal story for me. So where littleBits was started as a company. We had just raised a round of funding of $850,000, and as if you remember sort of my previous slide about how to make, there are a lot of dollar signs on the spend side, and so $850,000, almost every penny needed to go into the orders, into the product, into the R&D, and so we couldn't afford to put a lot of money towards rent. And yet we still needed a laser cutter, we still needed a 3D printer, we still needed a large space to host workshops, and we needed a space that looked professional and good. We didn't want to look like we were working out of our garage. Not that we have a garage, but okay. So basically we started at CoLab. We rented an office for $1,500. It was myself and my first employee at the time, and we basically started growing the company and hiring more people. By the time we had to leave, we were 8 people in a 10 by 10, making close to $1 million. So these spaces make a difference, and these community studios are really important. And then sort of underlying it all are some of the schools and the conferences that are doing it. So obviously big players in the field are ITP, SVA, Parsons, really sort of changing the way people think about education, really combining these different disciplines, and it's something that's really affecting the industry. On the upper right side, you see the Open Hardware Summit, which I founded with a very good friend, Anisha Gibb. Started as just an initiative to get a group of us open hardware enthusiasts together. This year it's going to be 4 years in the running and has close to 1,000 people involved every year between speakers and submitters and companies that are advertising, and it's now starting to span the entire world, so it's very exciting. Another type of, sort of similar to fostering communities, but this time on the online side, are some people that are creating platforms to encourage innovation. And I use the word platforms loosely because it's sometimes a hardware platform and sometimes it's an online platform. In the case of Quirky on the upper right, the company based in Chelsea that's built a full, almost fledged factory, a sort of slightly less factory, very, very advanced prototyping studio that has $350,000 3D printers. They have full metal shops, they have full plastic shops, really impressive machinery. And what they're basically saying to the world is, you know, you come up with an idea, whether it's a sketch, whether it's a full-fledged diagram, whether it's an invention that you've prototyped. Submit it to our website, the community will vote, and we will vote, and if it makes it through, we will help you make it happen. They've made, I think, close to 500 products, full cycle. They've gone them from prototype fully into production, into retail. They're in Bed Bath & Beyond, they're in Target, they're in all over the place. And they're doing that to innovators all over the world that are now starting to generate income from these ideas that they had before on napkin sketches that went nowhere. Adafruit, I talked about a little bit earlier when it pertains to the article, and MakerBot I talked about as well. On the lower right corner is Shapeways, who has actually developed a factory in Long Island City. It's a factory, I forget what is the size of the factory, but they've made close to 1 million parts in the factory. And it's, again, people that are submitting designs from all over the world that Shapeways is helping them make. So all of these sort of different initiatives that are happening, fostering communities, creating these platforms, makers that are making things that are solving complex problems. Now there's sort of a lot of potentially noise in this space. So you need the curators, you need the taste makers, you need the people that are filtering through and saying what works and what doesn't. And there are some initiatives and companies that are focused exactly on that in New York, especially for hardware and for maker products. Grant Street is probably one of my favorites. It's a simple website, a mailing list that you subscribe to, and basically they curate one new product every day from all over the world. It could be a gadget, it could be an invention, it could be a kit, it could be a toy. They're basically looking at fun, engaging products that they're then sending out to people, and it really sort of has started to generate a following. Another one, actually I would say maybe for sure that's my favorite, is Etsy. And Etsy is world renowned for being, you know, the world's #1 and biggest handcrafted marketplace. And Etsy, I would argue, helped spark sort of this, or at least accelerate this vintage movement and this going back to handmade, to the crafted, because it allowed craftspeople and makers from all over the world to be able to create their own vases or carpets or chairs or wedding dresses and put them on a website and find buyers. Not like eBay. Everything is handmade and everything is made with love, and you see it throughout the website, and it really becomes sort of a trendsetter in the field. And I would think that the sixth trend, and I would say that's something that's probably particularly happening in New York, but of course happening all over the world, but I think it's especially happening in New York, and is also very personal for me as well, is mission-driven making. We live in a city that is wonderful, but it is tough. It's a tough city to live in. There, you're able to see sort of problems happening on the political infrastructure side, on the financial side. You're able to see what's happening all around the world. You have the pulse of the world in New York, and so you're able to really see some of the problems. But so that becomes an opportunity for mission-driven making, for people that are starting companies that have missions. A very, very small selection of these is up here. On the upper left corner is Tech, which is a young company that is making technology to encourage adherence to medicine taking, and basically has this LED strip that lights up and it reminds you to take your medicine. And they're really sort of wanting to do it in a very subtle way, but also effective. On the upper right corner is Water Canary, who are making devices to test water. And these are very low-cost devices that you can use. That, I don't even know if we would call them devices, but they're sort of these pieces, well, no, they're devices, that would allow you to test water no matter where you are in the world for a very low-cost way. And that's happening out of New York. So even though we have very good water, most of the rest of the world doesn't. And so that becomes a really important invention. And then in the lower left corner is again one of my favorites, and one that is definitely very specific to New York, which is window farms. And the founder here, Britta Riley, basically decided that she loved homegrown crops, and she loved organic food, and she loved to have a garden. But she lived in New York, and she had a New York apartment, and of course had no garden and no ability to do that. So she decided to create a system for vertical garden using hydroponics. And I think this project is really, really important, because if you're able to get people that live in New York and Manhattan or Brooklyn apartments to garden and eat their own crops, I think that is a very, very big mission. If you could do it here, you could really do it anywhere. And then finally, the picture I have here is actually a picture, kind of a self-promotional picture, but I really think is something that drives us. littleBits is a mission-driven company. Our mission is to empower kids to innovate and empower kids to become problem solvers. And we get pictures like this from kids all over the world, and it invigorates us and it encourages us. And with all the difficulties of making, it is essentially why we make. And that's something that I think is really energizing. I want to close with this quote that I found from on the New York Top Makers website in the Q&A. I'm not sure who to attribute the quote to, but maybe Alison would know. But basically the quote is, the question was, why are you doing this? Why are you putting together the New York City Top Makers? And the answer was, about a year ago, we decided that makers were really important for New York City's economy for a variety of reasons. One is that people get excited about it, and when people get excited, money is exchanged, and that's economic development. I definitely agree with that argument, but I also would add to it that there's a few other layers that are very important as well. So about a year ago, we decided that makers were really important for New York City's, I would say, makers, children, environment, disabled citizens, algae, biology studies, medicine takers, water cooler delivery people, tech-savvy Pong players, bear window owners, and sort of any person in between. And, of course, the New York economy. So definitely this is something that's very important. I'm really excited to be here. I'm really excited about all the activities that are happening with the NYCEDC. And, I'm happy to stick around and help with any questions that anybody has. And I really encourage you to join the movement, no matter where you're coming from or what you do. This is where you want to be. Thank you.
That was so inspirational and exciting. It's very exciting what you're doing. I just want to remind everyone today that we are streaming live on demand. If you go to napovideoservices.com/CE Week 2013, you can see anything you missed for the last day or two. We'll be starting the next press conference momentarily. Thank you.